Perfect. Okay, let's crack on. I know that everyone's busy, and so I don't want to take up much of everyone's time. So we'll keep this fairly short and sweet. But what I just really want to do is talk about why podcasting is so important in 2023, but also, more importantly, how you can start your own podcast with almost a zero budget, and that's really the whole point of doing this. So let me just check that. Yeah, so this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at what's changed in the last few years. Starting your own podcast, which is actually much easier than most people think that it is. Examples of successful school podcasts, which is good. Measuring the ROI, super important. And then we're going to do all of that in just 4 slides. So first of all, then, let's just take a look at this. So who is this guy here that you're listening to right now? Now, some of you might know me. Some of you quite probably don't know me. I've been in the school marketing world for about 15 years or so. Before that, I spent 15 years being a marketing manager myself. So I understand the world of marketing, and I love the world of marketing. I used to work in an industry which was supplying independent schools with software. I loved marketing. I loved working with independent schools. I wasn't so keen on software. That's not really my jam. So I left there and set up my own business, which is Bonjour, and initially doing school marketing photography. And then 5 years after that, introduced school marketing video. And then this thing called a pandemic came along, and I found myself in a situation where all of a sudden schools were closed. And I saw that as a real opportunity to do something I'd always wanted to do, which was to start my own podcast, not to do with schools, but actually to do with photography and video. So I started that with the audience being other people who ran their own photography businesses. And that was all great. And I remember that launched on the Saturday, and I was super excited about the whole learning journey that I'd gone through to understand more about how to actually create my own podcast. And I went out for a walk in my local village on the Sunday, and I stopped. I remember I was walking down this hill, and there were trees overhead. Sun was going down, and I stopped dead on this bit of road because I was thinking to myself, why don't schools have their own podcast for their own marketing? And it suddenly occurred to me that it's something that schools could really absolutely have. And I figured that they didn't have it for 2 reasons. Number one, they didn't have time to do it. School marketing managers don't have time to do it, but also didn't quite know how to do it. So I set up a business showing schools how they could have their own podcast and helping them with that. And that was instantly more successful than I was expecting it to be. So the point really of all of that is that it's easier than most people think to start their own podcast, but sometimes you just need someone to show you a couple of the things that you need to do. So just give me a quick show of hands, or trying to work out how the chat here works actually, but maybe just give me a show of hands if you listen to a podcast already. And if you do, if you know, whether or not it's to do with work or anything else completely different, if you listen to something just for fun or anything like that. Okay, that's good. We've got some thumbs up coming through here, which is great. Now, podcasts are an excellent way for people to consume content. Generally speaking, people listen to a podcast when they're commuting to work, when they're in the gym, and when they're walking the dog. They're the 3 main places. And that's really important to remember, because in all 3 of those situations, people are already doing something else, and they're listening to a podcast at the same time. It's great to have a video on your website, but when you want people to watch a video, you have to stop them from doing what they're doing to get them to watch the video for 2 minutes or whatever. The important thing about people already doing something else is that because you're not stopping them from doing that thing, they'll carry on listening to a podcast while they're doing something else, which means you can have a podcast episode of 20 minutes and people will listen to a whole 20-minute recording. People won't normally watch a 20-minute video on your website. And actually, you're providing them with entertainment, something to do while they're on the treadmill. And in 20 minutes, if there's, for example, the head talking about how they got into education in the first place, then the audience will really connect with that head at a much deeper level, because unless the head is just giving a corporate message the whole way through, they're going to be talking about their own personal experiences, their own stories. And that's what people really love to connect with. So it's great that some of you are listening to podcasts already. That's super exciting. And we all understand what podcasts are, I presume. But if anybody doesn't, then do get in touch with me afterwards. So what's changed in the last few years? Some of you might recognize this guy here, but we have an increasing need for authenticity. this guy here was on the BBC. This is before the pandemic. And he was giving an interview from home, and all of a sudden his children come crashing into his home office, and then his wife comes flying in straight afterwards, because the children really shouldn't be in there. Now, things were different back then, because the idea back then is that things should be more polished, more kind of, if I say professional, it doesn't mean that we should be unprofessional today. But the idea back then was really that everything needed to be absolutely, top production value, if it was going to be on TV or radio or anything at all like that. But since then, things have changed. The pandemic massively escalated this as well. And people have much more of a need for feeling that they're receiving authentic information. So from a school point of view, to share content through a podcast, it's impossible to be completely corporate all the way through a podcast. You're going to get lots of authenticity coming through there. You're going to get the personality of the people who are talking, whether that's a member of SLT, whether that's just the head of drama, whether that's some of the pupils talking, anything at all, anybody like that. Well, while they're talking, all of that personality is going to be coming through. And really, that's what the audience is craving as much as possible. Real stories coming through. And I've got a couple of examples of this shortly that you're going to be hearing. People love stories. We keep hearing people like Seth Godin, the marketing guru, talking about how stories are the exact thing that we need to be sharing in our marketing. And a podcast is the perfect place for people to be able to do that. So that's one of the things that's changed in the last few years. But also, people do want deeper connections. They want to understand more about the people behind the scenes. They want to understand what happens in school. They want to understand what happens with your alumni after they leave school as well, or if you're a prep school, which school the children go on to and how they get on in those schools after they've left your prep school. So that understanding more about that is another thing that I believe has changed in the last few years. And then the obvious, of course, is that more and more people are listening to podcasts. It is a growing trend year on year. We're seeing more people actually tuning in and listening to them, which is a great thing as well. So starting your own, if you're here and you're interested in starting your own podcast, then there's a couple of things to think about, first of all. But I'd implore you, and you'll pick up on this throughout this, I'd implore you not to think too much about this, because if you overthink it, then actually you'll never actually start your own podcast. But first of all, think about the interview style. So whether or not you want to have maybe someone in your school who's the presenter for your podcast. When I say presenter, that sounds a bit glamorous, really, but really just the Graham Norton in your school, someone who's going to ask the right questions to a guest who's on your podcast. The guest, of course, it could be a member of SLT, it could be some of the children, and getting the children to talk about this is a really good thing. Maybe the children are the presenters themselves. It becomes an extended learning project then for the children. That's great for them, and parents do love hearing children speaking on a podcast. If children are running the podcast, then you just need to make sure that there's a good level of consistency there, because one of the things that the audience does enjoy is regular episodes coming out at regular times. They get used to episodes coming out maybe on a Wednesday or once a month or whatever it is like that. But then to think about what to communicate, and there are different ways of doing this. The main thing here really is that you communicate with as much variety as possible. If every episode is a member of SLT talking about something which is, if I say quite dry, I mean, it's okay to have this from time to time, but if you're talking about the strategy of how you teach sixth formers, for example, then that's great to have as one episode, but don't have that kind of style of recording on each episode, because your audience would just get a little bit bored of it. I've actually got my own podcast, which is aimed at school marketing managers. Intentionally, it's nothing to do with work, so I've called it I'd Rather Be at the Beach. Excuse me. And the idea of it really is that it's aimed at people just like yourselves who enjoy their work, but actually they'd rather be at the beach. So you can listen to it when you're not at work. People who are on that are generally other school marketing managers, and they're kind of not allowed to talk about work. So they can talk about themselves, what they do when they're not at work, but they're not really allowed to talk about work. It's just for a bit of fun, really. But I've noticed that with the variety issue is that I tend to start most episodes by saying, really looking forward to this episode. It's a little bit different because, and to have that variety from one episode to the next. Maybe have one person on one episode, three people on a different episode, someone who doesn't work in a school, someone who's completely separate, just to make it different from one episode to the next. It keeps people not knowing quite what's going to come, and that variety is really important. So who the guests should be, I mentioned about SLT, having the pupils on there as well. Getting the alumni back on, super important, because then people hear how the school shaped them into the person that they are today. In fact, yesterday, there was an episode with Berkhamsted School. I'm going to mention Berkhamsted in a moment. And it was one of their alumni. Maybe I shouldn't be sharing this because the episode hasn't been released yet, but it's one of their alumni who left the school in 1993. And he talks about how he was in the CCF at school. He then went to York University, but pulled out after the first year. His parents went nuts because he said he wanted to join the army. He then had a very successful career in the army. And he's talking in the recording about his experiences being around the world, being in the Middle East and Scud missiles and things like that, but also how the school helped him to get into the army through the CCF program. I was so struck by what he was talking about that after I heard this last night, I was on my own and I just wanted to watch a film. So I watched Guy Ritchie's The Covenant, and because it's set in the Middle East and it's all to do with that era when he was out there, when this chap was out there. And I watched it because I heard this podcast and I heard the stories that this guy was talking about. And it's all of these real stories, real connections coming through. Now, I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of school podcasts, but even though I've recorded over 800, or we've recorded over 800 episodes, I still get affected by the stories that I hear. And if I'm getting affected by them, then your parent community will definitely be affected by them in a positive way. The equipment that you need, very, very little equipment, actually. A lot of people don't start their podcast because they think that you need to have a great big recording studio, but you absolutely don't. In fact, all you really need is a microphone just like this one here. This is the Samson Q2U. If you're making notes, then write this one down. It's Samson, not Samsung. It's a Q2U. It's a great microphone, and you can see here on Amazon, it's £83. This screenshot is actually from last year. It's saying that I bought this on the 4th of March, 2022. Actually, I buy about 2 of these a month for different people who get in touch with me and they say, I want a podcast. What microphone should I get? So I just ship one of these to them because it's just easier. There's another one as well, which is virtually the same, and it's called the ATR 2100, ATR like Alpha Tango Romeo -2100, ATR 2100. Again, similar price point. You just plug it in on a USB cable and off you go. It's so simple to use. The quality, in fact, I'm using the Q2U right now. I'm talking to you right now. So it's great quality. It really is. So that's kind of all that you need regarding equipment is a laptop and this microphone here. And then you are off. So your investment needs to only be £83.73, may even be less than that on Amazon today. Now, putting your guests at ease at the start of the recording, this is really important because quite often when people are a guest on a podcast, they've probably never been on a podcast before. So you can reassure them by letting them know that that it's not live, first of all, and that it's not being broadcast live on any live stream, and to reassure people that actually you'll be editing the episode after you finish. And when I say editing, not to change anything, of course, that they're saying, but really it's just to remove any obvious ums or ers that come through that people might not like, and just to reduce any gaps where people are thinking. Because when your audience is listening to a podcast, they don't need that thinking time. Sometimes it is good to include a bit of pause because it shows that people are thinking about what they're talking about. So that's all good there as well. Do you need a question here? Do you need special software for the editing? No. So there are online services, and I'm not going to go into this today, but there are online services where you can subscribe with a small monthly fee. I mean, really just a few dollars a month. And you can edit your podcast content online. It's relatively easy to edit the content for a podcast because it's just audio, it's not video. And so if there's a great big pause, then you can cut that pause and nobody actually knows that you've cut that pause. Whereas if you had video as well, then of course you'd have a jump cut. Somebody would move from here to here. And then it's quite obvious that you cut something out. So that's less good. But it's quite good for that. Would you need to get 2 microphones for the ease of not sharing one? You can get two mics, but once you have two mics, then you do get more editing issues because you can get one microphone picking up the audio from the other person speaking into their mic. So if I'm speaking into this microphone here, and if I'm in the same room as somebody else, then my voice also gets picked up by their microphone, and then you end up getting a bit of an echo coming through. An echo doesn't sound good on the recording, so you need to reduce that because you'd end up having two audio tracks. Not going to go into technical detail right now, but actually the most straightforward way is just to, almost like you're on TV, just to pass it around and then to cut those. If you have like 3 seconds as someone passes it from one person to the next, in the editing you can just delete those few seconds, and it's great. So keep it dead simple. I hope that helps, Janine. Right, and then promoting the episode, because clearly you don't want to be recording episodes and then uploading them to Spotify and Apple if you don't promote them. By the way, it's crucial to put them on Apple and Spotify, because that's where about 90% of people will listen to your podcast episodes. Some people do make the mistake of recording content. They've got great content, great quality, great people speaking, but then they just put it on their website with a play button, and then they expect their audience to come and play it. But actually, if you're in the gym, you don't want to navigate to a website, on a school website, find the right page, click play, and then you put your phone back in your pocket and then it stops playing or whatever. People want to listen to a podcast where they listen to their existing podcasts. Maybe their existing podcasts, they listen to a Radio 4 or comedy podcasts or sport podcasts or whatever it is. So that's Apple and Spotify. So it's crucial that your school podcast is on those platforms there as well. Right. So examples of successful podcasts. We've got Berkhamsted that I just mentioned, so I won't talk much more about them. Down House School, they're a girls' boarding school. Give me a shout out if you know Down House School. Just give me a thumbs up in the chat or whatever. Tara Reeve is in charge of their podcast there, and they tend to do two of the pupils with one member of staff. So you can often get the staff member giving like the corporate message, and then the pupils saying what it's really like. And parents love hearing all of that, because then the school feels like they're sending out the right message, and then the parents feel like they're hearing what the children's experience is of that corporate message, which is really good. Who else? Whitgift. Now Whitgift do a great thing. They really mix it up, so different guests on each episode. The head, Chris Ramsey, will do, at the start of each term, he does a recording where he talks about what happened last term and what's coming up this term. But don't mistake that for being any kind of newsletter as such, because it's not really like this is a list of different things, but he's talking with his own personality, with his passion about working in the school. And as well as that he'll often talk about what he did during the summer holidays and, going away with his family on holiday somewhere. So people really connect with him at a deeper level because they're understanding more about him as a person as well as what he does. Snaresbrook Prep School, they are a very small school. They're about 240 pupils in East London. And the head, Ralph Dalton, he's heavily involved in their podcast, and he likes to speak on it on each episode, which is great because they are a smaller school. Some people think that you need to be an all-through school, day and boarding, age 3 to 18, to have a podcast. But there's a good example, really, of just being a small prep school and just connecting with the audience. And okay, his listen numbers are going to be less grand than a great big all-through school. But nevertheless, his audience is small, and it's not about getting thousands and thousands of listens per episode. It's just really about how big is your market, really, of current parents and prospective parents, and then making sure that those people are listening to those episodes. Millfield School, we've got nothing at all to do with Millfield School, but I've included them here because a lot of people say that they've got a podcast, and it's a good one. I haven't actually heard it, but according to other people, it's a good one to check out. So do go check that one out as well. Hall School Wimbledon, again, the head is involved in this. Again, not a very big school. The head is Andrew Hammond. He's actually Richard Hammond's brother, Richard Hammond from Top Gear with Jeremy Clarkson. And actually, it's not called Top Gear anymore, is it? But he's heavily involved, and he'll often be on each episode, and he's talking to the pupils in school. And it could be about the clubs that they run in school, or it could be that they've recently opened a sixth form and some of the pupils are staying on past their GCSEs into sixth form life. So talking to the pupils to understand from them what their thoughts and feelings are on all of that. QEH Bristol, another great one to listen to if you want to check them out. So measuring the ROI, I mentioned this earlier on, how to do this. Now, if you have a head in your school, or if you're a marketing manager and you have a marketing director and they're saying that you need to understand what the ROI is per episode, then, if they need to see that exact detail, then I'd almost encourage you not to get a podcast, because podcasting is very different to running something like a Facebook ads campaign, where you start it on this date, you finish it on this date, you know exactly what it costs, but also you know the click-through rate, the inquiries you get, therefore the number of open day visits that you get, and the number of places that are secured off the back of that. That's quite easy to do the ROI. Podcasting is much more long form marketing. And if you record episodes now, then you'll find that in 6 months' time, in 2 years' time, people are still listening to that content. So you put it out there now, it's very much evergreen. It's, even though I mentioned about Whitgift with Chris talking about what's happening this term, even there, people will still be listening to that in a year's time, even though they're not interested in what's happening, but they'll be interested in finding out more about Chris as a person. But where other people are talking, then it is, it's content which in the future people will be craving. And so it carries on very much so. But then also, what actually is ROI in the first place when it comes to this sort of thing? Is it a monetary thing? Is it a number of places thing? Or is it something separate? I mentioned Ralph Dalton being the head at Snaresbrook Prep School. And he said to me one time that there's a parent who every morning, the dad would drop the son off at school, and he didn't have a bad relationship with this dad. It was always just a little bit frosty. They just didn't really gel. They didn't connect. And this went on for a couple of years. Then Ralph recorded a podcast episode, and in the conversation, something came up about skiing. And it turned out that the head, Ralph, he enjoys heli skiing, where you jump out of a helicopter and you go skiing off-piste. And he just mentioned this and then carried on talking about some other things to do with school. And the very next day, that dad came in and he dropped his son off and he walked straight up to Ralph and he said, "Ralph, I had no idea that you were into heli skiing." They sat down, they talked about heli skiing and off-piste skiing for 45 minutes. And now this dad has become one of the school's biggest ambassadors. And the dad is now out there, and when he's at having a dinner party or when he's in Waitrose, doing his shopping, he's talking now about Snaresbrook Prep School as a proper ambassador for the school, because he's now got a much deeper connection with the head. And so it's that kind of thing that you can't really measure as such, but is much, much softer and much more longer lasting. So that's kind of what I'd say about that. But the last point, I don't know how we're doing on time. I haven't even got a watch, actually. What is it? 5 to 10. Last point, I'm not telling you that podcasting is a good thing just because we do it here, but instead we do it because podcasting is a good thing to do. It's a great way to connect with your audience. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast, then don't overthink it. Just start it. You might find that the first few episodes aren't quite how you want them to be, but that will always be the case with anything new that you're starting. That the most important thing is that you start it now, and then you get perfect later on. You don't have to wait to be perfect right from the word go, because if you do, then you'll end up never starting it. It's more important just to get content out there and to build this into your strategy, but not to overthink it too much, because if you overthink it, then it just won't happen. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm super keen to know if anybody here has any questions at all. Very keen to help you. If anyone has any questions at all they want to ask me afterwards, then I'm simon@thebonjouragency.com. I would have bought bonjouragency.com, but it was gone already. So I'm thebonjouragency.com. That's my phone number there. I'm actually based in Paris, but it's a London number, and I'm in the UK once a month anyway. So if anybody wants to get in touch, then please do so. But any questions at all from anybody? I'll stop sharing that for a second.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure there will be questions. I've got a quick question. Do you ever look at sort of breaking down a bit of a podcast and adding that maybe to a social media channel as a sort of a bit of a teaser, or is that something that you wouldn't recommend? Or because I know that a lot of schools, we struggle to come up with content for social media, and to me, the thought, if we've got a podcast and we can take little chunks, that can sort of, help give us more content?
Yeah, so these are called audiograms, and that's where if there's a 20-second extract from a podcast episode, and you're thinking, oh, that's a great little 20-second clip there, then you can take that part out. You can put it together with a media piece, and so you've got the branding for the school in the background, maybe with a waveform, so people can see if it's like, because it turns into a video actually on social media, like it's a 20-second video, and so it's important to have the subtitles on there, of course, for autoplay on silent, but also a waveform which is moving so that people can see there's something animated on there as well. And it just means that they can hear a 20-second extract, and then of course there's a link where they can go through and listen to the whole 20-minute recording.
Brilliant. And we've got a question here, which is a great question. Do you suggest a particular length of time for a podcast, or can it be any length?
Yeah. Now, typically here, this is where people will say, how long is a piece of string? Or you can have it as long as you want it to be for where it's relevant. What I would say is for a school podcast, around about 20 minutes is perfect, in my opinion. I mean, some people will happily listen for 40 minutes. We all understand what it's like. The longer something is, the less likely people are to listen through to the end. But the thing to remember is that if you get a very long episode, then actually people are hesitant to even start listening. If someone's only got 20 minutes to listen to a podcast, and there's a podcast which is, say, 2 hours long, then generally people won't spend just 20 minutes listening to the first 20 minutes. They won't listen to it at all, because they're thinking, right, well, actually in the first 20 minutes I'm not really getting into it properly. So if the episode itself is just 20 minutes long, then that's long enough to be deep enough into the conversation, but not so long that you scare people away and they don't even click to play it.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just thinking of this from the sort of recruitment side of things. When we're trying to attract parents to the school, it would seem to me that perhaps if you were to say to somebody, what are the 3 or 4 podcasts you should definitely do, one would be an interview with a head. What, I know you've said every podcast is different, but what would you sort of say are sort of the top ideas and sort of ones that get good hit rates?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So episode number 1 is it's great to do meet the head. What's the head really like when they're not at school, and almost to get them almost like they're not allowed to talk about school life. It's like you really want them to talk about what they do at the weekends, what they were like when they're at university. I mentioned QEH Bristol earlier on, and the head, Rupert Heathcote, really nice guy. He won't mind me saying he's quite a conservative kind of guy. And on a podcast recording, he was asked a question about what music he was into. What music he's into when he's not at school, and he was Guns N' Roses. He turns out Guns N' Roses. He's one of their biggest fans. He loves listening to this music and rocking out when he's in the car on his own. You wouldn't really expect that of somebody like him, but there'll be a large number of the parent community that will now be like, oh, he's into Guns N' Roses. So that kind of thing. Meet the Head, episode number 1 is great. Getting a couple of pupils, maybe pupils talking in year 7, what it was like joining the school, or if they've moved up from year 6, that's quite a big jump. So what's it actually like in year 7? Great time to record that would be October. So great to plan that in around about now, and then get them talking in October. Maybe episode number 3 could be a parent, or maybe 2 parents, maybe 2 mums who know each other, and they could both be on a recording. They just come into the school marketing office, and you're asking them some questions about what life is like as part of the parent community. If you're moving into the area, then how can you connect with other parents? And it just gives them a way of doing that kind of thing. Maybe episode number 4 is one of your alumni. They're talking about how the school helped them to become the person that they are. Maybe now they're working in the Far East, or they're on stage. Or if you have any notable alumni, to try and get them back on board, which is great, because then they can talk. They can be a good pull like that. And then maybe episode number 5 could be back to another member of staff. Maybe not SLT though. I mean, think about who the people are who talk with passion and excitement about the work that they do in school. St. Lawrence College did an episode a long time ago where it's their head of grounds who was talking. Now, you wouldn't really expect head of grounds to be on a podcast recording, but he was talking with real enthusiasm about how he loves to get the school to look good, so that when people arrive at the school, they go along the drive, and it just looks beautiful, and it makes them feel like they're in a lovely place. He really enjoys doing this. And then, of course, he talks as well about during holiday times, where parents can take their children to good National Trust places where the grounds look amazing, because he knows all of this good stuff. So there are 5 different examples for episodes 1 to 5. Quite often people worry that they might start a podcast and then run out of ideas for content. But again, if you start, then you'll find that other ideas just come, and you'll find people poke their head around the door of marketing. And they'll say, oh, I've got an idea for the podcast. Why don't you do such and such? And all of these new ideas come out. And then you end up having almost too many ideas. You want to do all of them in one go, but then you can't.
Brilliant. I mean, I think it's really interesting, because I think now, as you've just said, podcast is such a growing trend. I think every school, even if they don't want to be having regular podcasts, should have some, because certainly as a parent, when you go and meet the headmaster or the headmistress, you get 15-20 minutes with them, and you make an impression as to, you make a judgment as to what you think of them. So if you've had an accompanying podcast, I think that could really help. So I think it's quite interesting that it sort of plays, I think it will start to play more of an important role in sort of the overall collateral of the marketing materials you've got for a school, as well as, providing sort of that outreach to your existing community. So I think that was fantastic, Simon. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. I know it's often easier to get on these things in the school holidays, because you've not got people coming in and interrupting you all the time. And we look forward to next week. Next week, we have got Mark Dolby, and he will be talking, hopefully in a similar vein to Simon, about how you can get going with making some video content. So not your sort of perspective flashy video that you might have, but more little snippets, perhaps for results day or sports day or things like that. So that again should be a really good session. So we'll let you all get on with your days, unless anybody's got any further questions. And thank you all for joining us.